And this short video is just going to be having a look at plant productivity. Obviously we've been talking about photosynthesis up until this point, and we've been talking about the production of sugars, and those sugars are used in order for the plant to grow. So we're going to have a look, because we've been talking about food security and looking at growing food, then obviously when you're growing crops, you're going to be interested in how productive those crops are, how you can measure that productivity, what things limit that productivity. So first of all, when we're talking about plant productivity, how do we measure that? Well, we measure that by looking at the biomass of the plants, of that population of plants, that is its total mass. And how we measure that mass is usually by measuring the dry mass. So the water content is dried off, and that is because the water content varies in living organisms. It can vary throughout the year. So you want to find out how much of your crop that you're growing, what its biomass is. You don't want to be measuring water that might be good one week and less water the next week or whatever. You want to actually measure the mass of the living cells that you've produced in that crop. Now, we're going to have a wee look at some terminology here, and this terminology here called assimilation. So when glucose is produced by photosynthesis, that glucose can be converted into complex components of the plants. So we talked before about the sugars being converted into starch molecules or into cellulose or into proteins. Then that process, or that conversion of these carbohydrates that are produced by photosynthesis, is called assimilation. And that assimilation, in other words, that producing proteins, producing starch and so on, that increases the biomass of the plant, because what's going to happen is you're going to be promoting cell growth there. So you've got increased cells that are produced there. You've got starch that is being produced, and it's going to be stored in various parts of the plant, in the grains or in the tubers if you're growing potatoes or whatever. So you've got this process here called assimilation. Now, some of the sugar that is produced in photosynthesis is used up during respiration. So when we talk about assimilation, we talk about it in terms of net assimilation. That is the gain in the dry mass by photosynthesis minus the loss in mass caused by respiration. And that's what we mean by the terminology net assimilation there. So when we're talking in terms of plant productivity, the productivity is the rate at which the plants in an ecosystem generate new biomass. And it's measured as units of biomass per unit area, per unit time, e.g. per grams, per square metre, per, I've got written here, year, it's actually per year. Now, factors that will affect plant productivity, well, these are obviously your limiting factors there. Anything that affects photosynthesis will affect plant productivity. And that includes temperature, light intensity, and carbon dioxide concentration. There are other factors that will affect that plant productivity as well. You know, if you think of fertilizers or whatever, but I'm just naming some of the limiting factors here. Now, if you want to assess the productivity of a harvest, then you can do that using something called a harvest index. And I'm just going to go through how that is done. So for crops to grow efficiently and to make sure that you're getting your maximum yield from them, then you want to be able to assess the growing potential of an area. So we've got this term here, it's called the biological yield, and it's the biological yield of an area is the total biomass of the plant produced. So that is useful because it tells you the total producing power of the land. So what we're talking about here is if you're producing a plant, say, is has got a long stalk, and then it's got this head of corn up here. Then the biological yield is the total biomass of all of that. When we talk about this term here, though, called the economic yield of an area, that's the mass of the desired product. In other words, the mass of this part here, say if it's barley, the barley grains that have been produced, not the stuff that is not the desired product. So to calculate the harvest index, it's calculated using this formula. That is the dry mass of the economic yield. So in other words, the part up at the top here, this bit here of your plant that's got your barley grains in it, divided by the dry mass of the biological yield. That is the yield of the whole of your crops. I'm not just talking about one plant here, I'm talking about all the crops that are in one field. And that would give you a useful estimate of what is wasted during the growth of a crop. It might be that if you're growing a crop that's got very tall stalks and those stalks aren't used, just the top part is grown, you might be wanting to be looking at some selective breeding or some genetic engineering to make your stalk smaller and your head larger, because this is the part that you're wanting to harvest. It may be that the stalks with certain crops are being used elsewhere, say for feeding cattle or whatever, but this is how you would calculate the harvest index. So this is just a summary of some of the terms that are used when it's being talked about in terms of plant productivity.